So I ask you to use your microphones when you speak. Don't forget to turn off your mics. So we begin right now. So a very good afternoon to all of you. Congratulations, we have this wonderful event, the Zinoviev readings. This conference got off to a very good start, and we are very grateful to Rossiya Segodnya news agency for this hospitable welcome, for inviting all these leading experts from across the world who came here to share their perspectives, their opinions, and their thoughts. So since we have a very interesting and important roundtable discussion about youth in politics, I want to say that initially the topic was different. It was youth in power, because probably we sometimes lack a more clear message. And instead of starting with my report, I would like at first ask our speakers to present themselves. There are a lot of prominent people around the table, and I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Hauke Ritz. You have the floor.
For my speech?
Нет, выступление.
Your remarks, please. Yes, your presentation.
Thank you very much.
And please present yourself as also.
My name is Hauke Ritz. I'm from Germany. I'm as a publicist engaged in foreign policy analysis and German-Russian relation, and I have also a philosophical background. My talk today will address the role of the youth in politics, and because of this issue I have decided to speak about the most well-known historic event when young people really had an impact on politics and the ambivalence that is connected to it. I'm speaking about the youth revolt of 1968, or the student revolt of 1968, which started in the United States, continued in France, swept to West Germany, and also to Czechoslovakia, even if they are a little different. And for many decades, this event was seen simply as the expression of political freedom and progress. But I would like to propose that we, from today's standpoint, we may have, or we can get a quite different view on this event. And I'm saying this because we have in the last 10 to 20 years seen several so-called colored revolution in several parts of the world. For example, in Georgia, 2003, in Ukraine, 2004, in Egypt, 2011, and once again in Ukraine, 2014. And those colored revolutions basically function in a way that outside forces, with a lot of organization power and money, engage public relation companies who start to organize the young generation of a country for the purpose to create unrest and sometimes even a regime change. And this reality of colored revolution in our present times, I think, forces us to look with a different view back on the year 1968. I'm not saying that the student protest of 1968 was a color revolution as well. I think the event was more complex. But nevertheless, I would like to describe this event in the context of the Cold War at that time. Because the upheaval, the student protest of 1969 was the beginning of a start of a large cultural transformation of the Western world, of European culture. And I think we have to get a clear head about our recent past to understand where we are going. Today we see the Western world as a dominant force in the Cold War, and this hinders us to realize that at the beginning of the Cold War, in the first decade and maybe in the first 2 decades, the Western world had some profound weaknesses. And it could indeed have happened that the West would have lost the Cold War. I will try to explain why this is the case. And this influenced the decision-making processes of the Western elite. So the Cold War was a stalemate in terms of military power, also to a large extent in terms of economic power, and that's why culture became so important in the Cold War. I think culture was the main battleground of the Cold War because this was the field in which finally the decision of the Cold War would be made. And at the first 1 and 2 decades of the Cold War, the West had a disadvantage toward the East in exactly this field. And this is because of the fact that large parts of the world at that time had already become socialist countries. China was a socialist country. A large portion of the world population lived under socialist governments, and also geographically the realm of control of socialist countries was quite impressive. And then there was the Third World, and the Third World was largely colonized, and it seemed that socialism was a perfect ideology to address the desire for liberation in those Third World countries. And if socialism would have spread throughout the Third World and infected one country after the other, this would have meant that the Western world would basically be imprisoned on its own territory. It would have lost the access to outside markets and resources, and that would basically have caused the end of capitalism as a world system. Furthermore, the West had even more Achilles heels in the early stage of the Cold War. There was a quite organized workers' movement in most West European countries. Socialist and even communist parties in Italy and France, a lot of socialist publishing houses and newspapers. The majority of the population in the industrialized world was at that time workers, and they were deeply embedded in the culture of the workers' movement and so forth. Even more so, many intellectuals of that time were in favor of socialism. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Einstein, and even the once former conservative author Thomas Mann voiced openly their sympathy for socialism. At the same time, liberalism appeared discredited at that time. We have forgotten about this, but directly after the Second World War, a lot of people, including a lot of writers and artists, thought that liberalism had caused the competition between imperial powers, therefore had caused World War I, and that the competition between imperial powers was also responsible for the Treaty of Versailles, which laid the ground for the Second World War. Finally, liberal economics was also seen as responsible for the world economic crisis of 1929, which paved the way for the later rise of fascist movements and later fascist states. So at that time, in the 1950s, liberalism seemed to be discredited. It was no longer seen as a vital intellectual option for the future of humanity, at least not in its full extent, only maybe in a limited version. And on the other side, socialism seemed to have all the intellectual answers which could solve the problems created by liberalism. And in this, so there was a kind of cultural momentum for socialism. The whole world was moving in this direction. And of course, the Western elite, the security apparatus of the United States and many other NATO countries, they understood this. And they understood if things progress as they did in the 1950s, that they could lose the Cold War in the field of culture. And so the idea came up in the security apparatus that somehow the progressive appearance of socialism had to be resolved. So the task was to remove the progressive appearance of socialist thinking, socialist political theory, the workers' movement, and connect it once again to liberalism. And this the first reaction of the situation of the Western elite was the McCarthy era. The McCarthy era was a very, very conservative, reactionary reaction towards the strength of socialism. But later on, they understood that the authoritarian habits of McCarthy were not the right answer to the challenge. And so they decided we can only stop the cultural momentum of socialism if we engage with the left itself. So the task was we need a kind of new left. We have to detach the left from socialism. And this could only be done by another kind of left. So the idea was that we have to create a new left which is still critical enough to attract idealistic-minded people, which is still interesting enough to attract intellectuals and writers, but at the same time don't ask the core question of the left movement. So would not ask, for example, the question of ownership, would not ask or discuss the question of imperialism and war and peace. Instead, the idea was that the side issues of the left discourse, for example, environment issues, the discussion about human rights, minority rights, discrimination, the critique of outlived traditions, the critique of the church, that this kind of criticism could become the new center of the new left. And this kind of left could be integrated in the capitalism. It could help the capitalism to modernize itself, to get a human and progressive appearance once again. And this could decide the cultural Cold War in the favor of the Western world. And we have to say from today's perspective that this strategy was indeed to some extent successful. The West in the 1980s, the new kind of left, the new left really became a cultural factor in the Western world, and the West was, for some decades, appeared more modern than the Eastern socialist states. And maybe this strategy indeed has decided the Cold War in favor of the Western camp. Yet it has to be said that the West had to pay a price for this. And the price was that its own culture became detached from the real issues. So the strategy was always to promote side issues and to put them into the center. And this has transformed Western societies in such a way that they today can no longer address core questions and core problems of humanity. Instead, we are discussing if there should be a third toilet for sexual minorities or people who are unclear about their sexual identity, or we have endless discussion about different groups in society and their rights, and this kind of discussion is filling the public space, and we are no longer capable of discussing the historic outlook of human civilization. And so, yes, the West has learned to dominate the Cold War with this strategy, but the price was that he has weakened and maybe deeply harmed its own cultural foundation. And now we are in the midst of a kind of new Cold War, and in this new Cold War appears in a moment when artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, data mining are in a crucial point of development, and it has to be said that these more and more artificial culture of the Western world is a fruitful ground for the full implementation of these technologies. And I would like to end my speech with the analysis that in this new Cold War, the center of this new Cold War is the question how these new technologies will be implemented within our societies, within human civilization, if they can be somehow limited and controlled, or if they are simply used to create a new type of culture which would be not in favor of the majority of the people. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, спасибо.
Thank you so much. This was Hauke Ritz. Any questions to the speaker? Any questions? Yes, please present yourself and use the microphone, please. I'm a member of the Zinoviev club, so my question is the following.
Intellectual level of modern neo-Marxist discussions in Germany and in Europe.
I should comment how the level of discussion currently is.
Intellectual level of neo-Marxist theories modern.
See, the main problem we have in the
maybe new ideas, maybe new.
The problem is, I can speak. I'm mostly referring now to Germany, but I think the situation in other Protestant countries of Europe may be similar. We have in Germany today a large amount of political correctness. So, and this has led to a situation where the fantasy, the power of imagination has become limited. And so, if I follow the intellectual discussion in Germany, they are in comparison to the discussion I see here in Russia, they are far more limited. They, because everybody is fearful to overstep a line. Very quickly somebody comes up and say, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, this is anti-Americanism, or something like this. And I think especially the Protestant countries of Europe are affected by this political correctness. Scandinavia, Great Britain, the United States. I think in the Catholic countries there's more freedom of imagination today.
Спасибо. Спасибо. Вот, Нелли Константин, пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Thank you. The next question. I'm a professor at the National Economy Public Administration Academy. I do not speak English, unfortunately, and my question is, it was said in the first session, in the morning session, that Europe is boiling, and is Germany boiling? At the time, West Germany took a big part of East Germany, so it's a socialist country. So what is happening in Germany? Is Germany boiling now?
Yes, Germany is in the way boiling that we have a growing amount of the population which has detached himself from the mass media, which has created its own space on the internet. But on the other side, I'm a little bit pessimistic when it comes to new thoughts coming from Germany, because for historical reasons, the Germans have not the possibility, for example, like the people of France or of Italy, to be simply proud on their nations and refer to the past. The French people can easily refer, for example, to the French Revolution. In Germany, this kind of historical reference is far more complicated, and this limits our ability to gain a political consciousness, to free ourselves from a dominant mindset. I think the change that we need will not come from Germany. It will come maybe from France, from Italy, from other places in the world, and only if there some progress has occurred, Germany may be affected as well.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. So moving on from Germany to France. So now I give the floor to Christine Mestre, who came to France. So please, you have the floor. So yes, we have cameras everywhere. So, Madam Zinoviev asked me to say a few words about 1968. I was a participant in these events, and in my life, I had this chance twice to be in a situation where I have the feeling that I played a certain role in history, that I'm a person and a human being. The first time was in 1968. I was 17 years old, and the second time was 10 years later. So it was on August 8, 1978, when the Zinoviev family came to Munich, to the Munich airport. This was something great for me, since for 2 years I was ousted banished from the Soviet Union, and I left them in the Soviet Union. I was so afraid that they would be arrested and jailed. So when they came to Munich, it was a great joy for me. It was also a victory. The fact that the government could not have this symbolic victory over the author of the Yawning Heights was a great joy, and they helped me play a role in the publication of this book in Europe. And for me, this was a personal victory, that I played a small role in history, and I had this feeling that I do exist as a social being. I will say a few words about May 1968. These were something unprecedented, something unique that happened in France back then. And it was a combination of two things. It was a protest movement among students and a massive, powerful workers' movement that lasted for 6 weeks. And 10 million people were on strike, workers, officials, public employees. And for France, this is a huge thing. Nothing worked back then. Only stores were selling what was left over. There was no transport. Schools were closed. Hospitals could barely operate. So this was really unimaginable. In France, we have this revolutionary tradition, and we have this love of demonstrations, of riots, and we had 4 million people who came together, not only recently, against terrorist attacks. Nothing, there was no warning. When every person realized what happened, everyone took to the streets. So we had this instantaneous desire, and there were 4 million people in the streets, and this is really impressive. So maybe everything is not lost for France. In May 1968, every day was a huge demonstration and a lot of fights. We really went to the streets to fight. And for this reason, this movement was called a revolution. Why did it happen in this period of economic growth and prosperity? France changed a lot after the 2 world wars. There were also wars for independence in the colonial world. And after all these conflicts, the country started developing, and it was developing. The demographics changed a lot. Before that, France was an agricultural country, and people started to move out of the rural areas and move to the cities. So people who earn wages, who are not small business people, who are not employed in the agricultural sector, there were more and more people of this. The number was growing by 20% every year. And there is this baby boom generation because after the war a lot of people were born, there was this demographical boom, and now there is this problem with the retirement pensions because of us, because of the baby boomer generation. I would like to give you some numbers. There were young people, the country was getting younger and younger, and they also went to universities. In 1950s, the number of students in France was 140,000 people. And in 1968, it was 2.5 million people. So just to have this idea how the society changed. So as people left from rural areas to work in the cities, people gave up on their patriarchal values. During the First World War, women started working. At the time, all men were fighting at war, and so women became more independent, and they did have some rights. They were no longer entirely under the authority of men, and in France, there were new aspirations and new needs. So it was not only the society in its structure that was changing, but also the mentality of the population. After these years, the country became richer. There was a lot of economic growth, a lot of progress, and the consumption society became an ideal. And the world evolved into a huge supermarket where the main role assigned to humans was to be a consumer and to be a producer, because nothing is free. Back in the Soviet days, and Madame Zinoviev remembers this, people could not understand this. It was totally different, that everything is available in stores, but to buy it, now everyone knows this, but people at the time did not know this, that you have to work so much to buy all the things that are available in the stores. So this was a new society that was built. In 1968, young students no longer wanted to be manipulated by marketing and by the media. Many of the slogans were about the media, against censorship, because at the time there was actual censorship in France. It may be surprising from today's point of view, but films were banned from being aired at the time, and it was shocking. And people started thinking that they do not want to lose their lives and their souls just to make a living. In May 1968, the main question for the society was to be or to have. As someone have already said during the morning session, what happened back then? The crisis of family values, the struggle against censorship, the consumption societies, for women's rights, for equality. And I have to remind you that women got the right to vote only in 1945. Before that, there was this universal suffrage. It was universal suffrage, but women were excluded of it until 1945, which meant that only men were able to vote. And only in 1968, women were able to have a checkbook. So in the Soviet period, yes, there were no checkbook, but women were able to vote since the 1917 revolution. In 1968, it was an extraordinary time. and one of the examples is that people wanted to change their lives in all its aspects. And it was everywhere, in schools, in universities, in families, in companies, in hospitals, in prisons, in theaters, during the Cannes Film Festival, everywhere for several weeks. The entire country came to a halt, and everywhere people came together day or night to talk for hours, to discuss how they can contribute to the society and how can they change what they do. And everything stopped just as suddenly as it began. Summer months were approaching, and the government conceded to have some wage hikes. There was fuel at the gas pump once again, and people were able to leave for vacations, and everything ended very suddenly. And the trade unions did sign an agreement with the government, agreeing on some social reforms. And we were naive at the time to think that after these incredible weeks, nothing will be as it was before, and that everything will be different. But it was not. It not happened this way. But this is another story. We discussed my leftist views with Mr. Zinoviev on a number of occasions. And every time he listened to me very carefully and he discussed everything I had to say. And every time he told me, you will see when you will have communism, there will be no wine and no oysters, since I'm from Bordeaux, where we eat oysters and we drink wine. But his views did change while he was in the West. And I'm glad that it did happen. We were part of these events of 1968, and we protested. And what we protested against was the big emergence of this globalistic society in which we live today. The early days of this global supermarket that feeds us all, and we have no choice. This is what we opposed at that time. And despite all the talk about democracy, about these notions of choice and on, this is not always obvious, and we do what we're expected to do. And this is sad. And because politicians can change very little, I'm unlikely to have this small part, to be a small part of history in the future once again. And I really feel sorry that, for the young people. They do not have a future like this, it seems at least. They have, it seems, very little chance, very little opportunity to be part of a major process, a major project where they can fight and feel that they exist as a social being, as you playing a role in your country. And this is sad. This is what I had to say. Thank you so much. Any questions to our speaker? I'm a second-year student. I cannot agree with you that young people have no ways to express themselves. The protest movements that we see in our country and across the post-Soviet space, there are mass movements. There are a lot of people that are involved, and young people are an active part of this. And my question is, Russia, is it behind Europe? Is it lagging behind, or it has its own unique path? I think that Russia is on its own, of course. I'm very glad if you have a vision for the future and you have movements you can join. I know that in France, young French people who are pure French, people from France, if they turn to Islam, they do sometimes go to Syria. The French people, not Arabs who live in France, but French people. This means that the society has nothing to offer, cannot offer an alternative. I'm not speaking about Arabs, third or second generation, but I'm speaking about French young people who were born in France, whose grandparents and grandparents were born in France. They adopt Islam and they join the jihad in Syria. This means that the society does not have a project for them. If Russia does, it's wonderful. I do not see this. I live in Paris, and at every corner I see young people speaking Russian. They come to France to work in our country. Maybe these are people who want to have rather than to be. Maybe there are other people who have a future. I do not think that Russia is special. Russia is a country that has its own life, it has its own path in development, of course, but that will be my answer. Thank you so much. Any other question to Christine? Okay, thank you very much. We, as hospitable hosts, we want to give the floor to our guests. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Toschi-Marazzani-Visconti, our guest from Italy. Please use the microphone.
Talk about 1968. Well, at that time, actually, I was playing the role of a wife and a mother of 2 children. So I could see, the big revolution from my windows. And for me, it was a sort of a dance, because I could see the police and the revolutionaries, one in front of the other, and they were marching one against the other, and the other one was backing up, and the other were advancing, and that was it. But seeing, that situation from far, I must say that there were good things and bad things, in the sense that it was good that the young people could be interested in a future world. And then it was very good for the workers to obtain, particular a good syndicate to protect them, and some good possibilities of work with protection, because sometimes at that point everything was still very old-fashioned. And there was the rise of feminism, which was very good, because feminism, of course, was breaking up with some very, very old-fashioned rules. A woman should stay home, make, good meals for the family, have a lot of children, and that was it. Now, what's the bad result of all this? The bad result is that all this period prepared for our country the rise of Berlusconi. And you all know Berlusconi, probably. Well, anyway, he was a very wealthy industrialist and entrepreneur. And he became, prime minister, and he stayed there for about 20 years. And personally, I think he ruined completely our society, the point of view of our society. But why it happened? Because he was practically, his party was practically a right party. I mean, definitely right. But the reason why he had such a result is the fact that going back to 68, for example, the students and the parties that were just, helping the students or backing the students, imposed a political mark to students' exam, which was a terrible thing, because right after we had people that were not professional, were coming out from university, and they had to start all over again because they were not prepared. And this is one bad thing. The other bad thing is that with the very, very strict rules, the industry that was going so well at that point started losing points. And actually, right now, we could have done much more. Because I must go back to the end of the war. Right after the war, Alcide de Gasperi, who was our first premier, our minister, first minister, went to Washington and signed a sort of a very special contract. I think it was a contract. He sold our souls to the devil, I guess, because until now we have 114 US bases in Italy, and which means that we are a colony, an American colony. But we had back the Marshall Plan, which made us, which made us all able to eat and to work, and provided industry for new machineries, and we started doing very well. So in '68, industry was flourishing, trade was flourishing, everything was, very well. So there was something behind all this, why this was all so much extremed. So, when industry don't go well, have problems with the unions were not helping people to become professional, and they were protecting people who were trying to stay away from work for a lot of time without any excuse. If they were going in front of a court, the court was saying that the worker was right, and the entrepreneur was obliged to keep the man and just pay him for his holidays in a way. All this made us come to Berlusconi, which I think ruined completely our way of thinking, and especially young people. Because, I think the maximum he would say to a young girl, for example, you're beautiful, try to get a good husband, a very wealthy one, use your beauty, which is exactly, what we fought against for so long. So this is the point, that there were good things, bad things. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. Questions to our Italian guest? Okay, thank you. Moving on, we have our next speaker, Mr. Todorov. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm first to present myself. I'm a philosopher, a writer, and a political analyst. And I also talk about the phenomenon of 1968, which is a very complex phenomenon, because it's not very simple to describe it like what happened in Paris or in Prague, because it includes student movements, Afro-American resistance, workers, hippies, Marxists, anti-colonial movement in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the whole psychedelia, and the whole boom of social imagination that we had in the '68. It was the whole world was actually boiling at that time. Also in the United States, there were lots of things going on. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was shot in 1968. So the United States, the generation of the '68, also experienced this huge, despair at that time. So I think there are two possible ways of explaining what happened or didn't happen, or two possible hypotheses. One of which is that it was a year of failures. A year that there were some possibilities of huge change, of huge social imagination, but it was cut down, it was stopped, it was suppressed, or didn't manage to develop. And the other possible position is that that year was actually a time of a turning point, which means that lots of things happened, and lots of things happened that have a meaning for us today. And also something very important, when we talk about 1968, there are different ways to describe what actually happened then. One of which is, okay, let's start with the political, maybe some kind of leftist uprising, thinking of something completely new, social project. Then you have the explanation that it is actually a revolt of a generation, which means a clash of generations, which includes also the feminism issues, includes lots of things that the young generation of 68 couldn't go on anymore, living like that, or didn't want to live like that. Then you have the explanation that it was actually a revolt against ideology, against society and civilization as it is. And also a revolt against an unfuture. I'm really sorry for the interpreters, but maybe the Russian word would be nebudushe, so the impossible future, because this generation of 68 didn't really see a future for itself. It wanted to create a new possibilities and a new world. It wanted to examine or to re-examine all its values in its consciousness. And the great fear was that all these things that happened, that contemporary capitalism was capable of absorbing all these critical ideas and embedding them or bringing them into its own advantage. And here I want to mention a very important book that was published in France in 1967, so a year before, by Guy Debord, the Society of Spectacle. Many people, many analysts think that this was the book that sparkled the student movement in 1968. And the book is, one of its main theses is that in late capitalism, everything becomes a spectacle. Everything is lived as a spectacle. Even revolt, even resistance can become a kind of a spectacle, which means there is no possible way to resist. But let me say something else. I think that if we put these two possible positions, on one side, nothing really happened, it was suppressed, etc. On the other hand, something very important happened. Maybe I prefer the second position. I think what happened, and let me start with saying a few words about what happened in Prague. It was the beginning of a death of an ideology. This is also what happened in France. This is also what happened in the United States. And I have to elaborate on that. Here I disagree with Zinoviev, who was thinking of Soviet communism as a kind of a social system that would exist for millennia. And he was saying that these cold warriors, so some foreign agents, actually destroyed this social system and destroyed the Soviet Union. I think, okay, maybe, of course, there were interventions, but there was also an inside process. In this inside process, I call a death of an ideology. After the Prague events, which was the possibility of this socialist society to flourish or to develop or to go on, what we observe in the Eastern countries, in the Eastern so-called Eastern Bloc, is the start of an agony. The start of an agony of an ideology, the start of a stagnation. And we see it in most Eastern European countries. That is gerontocracy, also consumerist socialism, and it all ended in the 80s, but not because there was some kind of a radical intervention, because the ideology was not able to be vital anymore. It lost its vitality, and this was a very crucial moment. And I think what happened in the West was also a beginning of a death of an ideology, because after 68, or 68 marked this moment when capitalism lost its energies to be socially effective. It was the end of the welfare state. It was the end of the social capitalism and the start of a counter-revolution of neoliberal ideology and conservatism, and actually what we have today, which is the collapse of classical capitalism. And I think this is a very important point. The death of an ideology that we experienced in the Eastern countries is a very traumatic experience. And I think we still we still experience the symptoms and the consequences of this death. Here, my colleague Ritz mentioned that the color revolutions. But the color revolutions are also symptoms of death of an ideology. And what happens today in countries like Poland, like Hungary, is also a consequence of death of the death of an ideology. So we have to keep in mind that it's a very traumatic experience. And then the first position, which says nothing happened, usually it focuses on that moment that after 68, the generation of 68, which was very enthusiastic, which involved itself in a social project and a kind of a revolution, just a few years later, it was the generation described as the generation of narcissism, the narcissistic generation, which means not that they were literally narcissists, but this generation didn't believe in any authorities anymore. It didn't believe in politics. It didn't believe in religion. It didn't believe in social movement or social project. It didn't believe in anything. It didn't believe even in economy, because in the 70s you had huge economical crisis in the West, and people were already sure that maybe the economy could collapse at any moment. And let me give you some dates, because this is it's not a coincidence, that in 1976, the American rock band Blue Oyster Cult has the song, "This Ain't the Summer of Love." This ain't the summer of love. This is almost 10 years after 68. There is no belief anymore that this is the new age is coming, or a new society is possible. In the same year, 1976, The Yawning Heights is published in Switzerland, where Zinoviev describes the communist reality, and he mocks it in a sarcastic way because he's disillusioned. 1 year later, 1977, Sex Pistols has the song No Future. There is a kind of exhaustion of resources for future. There is no belief in future anymore. And then we have this world of Brezhnev, Reagan, and Thatcher. I think this is like a very dark times that were after 68, also for the East and for the West. And also, let me say a few words about the naivete, because every revolution, every
Прошу прощения, еще 2 минутки, ладно?
2 minutes just, okay?
moment of social change needs a kind of naivete. And this was a time of this naivete that was produced then. Now we've lost it. We don't have this naivete anymore. We live in the age of the cynical reason, where we know what the power is in the ideology, but we still go on the same way. And let me finish with this, with the mentioned Guy Debord, who already in the 90s was convinced that we are already in a situation of life and death, and that we are facing a dilemma, revolution or suicide. And Guy Debord shot himself on the 30th of November 1994 with a bullet in the heart. And I hope this situation is to be overcome, not in favor of death. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. Just a moment. We have a great joy today. For the first time, as a part of the Zinoviev readings, we have the co-chair of our club, Olga Zinovieva, the co-chair of the Zinoviev club, and we have Valery Grinin, who is head of the board of trustees of Russia-Germany Society. So, Ms. Zinoviev, you have the floor. I do not want to speak here as a co-chair of the Zinoviev Club. I want just to contribute to the discussion that we have at this round table, and not as a president of Russia-Germany Friendship Society. And we have a person who will answer these questions. I wanted to make 2 points, just to make precisions. You know that what makes Zinoviev's logical thinking different is that before speaking about something, you have to agree on terms. He was always against any ambiguity in terms. Whenever he said something, he meant it. He never played with the meanings, with the words. You mentioned at the outset that he saw the blame that there were Western intervention was to blame for the demise of the Soviet Union and the features of Western lifestyle that destroyed this ideological foundation of this Soviet system. It would be strange for Zinoviev to say this. What he said and what he meant clearly, that the destruction of the Soviet Union was a result of various forces, including the internal opposition, whether you call it a fifth column or any other way. This was not a process that came uniquely from the West or from Washington. This is my first point. Well, what second point did I have? Well, it seems that it slipped just out. What I wanted to add. Well, what I will not tell you anything new when I insist that we get truth. Truth results from a discussion, and what we see at this Zinoviev Readings conference that we're holding for the 9th time since the death of Zinoviev, and the fact that we have so many young people. These young people do have a future, despite the fact that French people, young people in France join the Islamic State. We have the story with Varvara Karaulova, this tragic story, great talent, a wonderful student, straight-A student, is discovered among the people who wanted to join ISIS. It was a tragedy, not just for the family, but for the entire country. It was a tragedy for the Faculty of Philosophy of the Moscow State University, where she studied. So what I want to say is that we must have questions, and the more questions we have, the better. And the better chance we have to avoid mistakes in the future that could have been addressed had we asked these questions at the proper time. Yes, please. The young person on the second row. I'm a journalist and activist. I have a question to Mr. Todorov. More than 30 years have passed since what happened in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and China is still there. They do not have this crisis of ideology. What can you say about China?
Obviously, China has a change in ideology since they started a new project, a new kind of society. And what we see in China is something very interesting, because it's a kind of a laboratory now, China, where we see capitalism controlled by the state and by the party. And it seems that it's very interesting about the nature of capitalism also, that we're used to, at least in Europe, we're used to think, or we are taught to think, that capitalism has to always do something with democracy, that capitalism and democracy go together. And this is how it was presented also in Bulgaria and in Eastern Europe after the changes. We have the democracy, this, you know, luxurious package of democracy, and under it, it was the ugly capitalism in its late stages of neoliberal development. And in China, in other countries, where we have a situation that is not the kind of a liberal democracy we have in the West, capitalism is thriving much, much better, obviously. So I think that China is like the only place which preserved this project, and it's a completely different thing. It's incomparable than what happened in Europe.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you. You had a replica, right?
Said consumerist socialism, yes? Very interesting term. Very interesting. I didn't listen it before.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое. Так, прошу, Наталья, представьтесь.
Natalia, please. And please be brief because we have a short time.
Hicks, I have a question. You were saying that young people were disappointed in a way in the future, about the future. And how do you think, what about now? What about our modern youth? How do we feel about the future?
It's a very deep question, but if we see how it looks like from the point of view of culture, and if we think that we live in a situation where there is no future anymore since the 70s, and we develop a certain kind of retrotopias, which is idealizing the past and trying to come back to some forms of, you know, nationalism, or idealizing for Russia, like idealizing the Tsarist times, the feudalism of Russia, the office, you know, this kind of retrotopias are very, very typical for our times, because we don't see any horizon in the future. And something more, if you see the culture of the 90s, which was dominated by a spirit of despair, a spirit of, you think of this alternative rock and grunge and all these kind of things which happened in the United States and then in Europe. It's a culture of resignation. It's a culture of like embracing despair. There is unbelief in the future, but it doesn't produce an energy for social change. Maybe we should have somehow bring back this naivete so that it is possible for us to imagine a new kind of society.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое. Да, вот, пожалуйста, представьтесь.
Yes, please present yourself, only briefly, please. My question is a follow-up to the previous one. In 5 years, we have a new generation of baby boomers. 2004, 2014, we had a baby boom. So we're in the next 5 to 10 years. Do you think that any similar movements are possible, youth movements that would be similar to 1968 to the new left? Is this possible? The French guest said that this would not be possible. Do you believe that this is possible?
I'm afraid that it's not possible to have these movements coming. Why is it not possible to see that? Because, as I said also in the previous panel, maybe we should experience a kind of a catastrophe or a kind of a collapse of capitalism in the way it is right now, or a collapse of contemporary society, so that we are able to produce something new, or that we are able to have the energy to imagine something new. And we have to keep in mind that in a few years there will be major changes in the way people live. I will also like to quote Ray Kurzweil, who is a futurologist and one of the main engineers of Google, who predicts that in the near future, in the next decades, we will have a rapid development of artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligences will become our teachers, our friends, our lovers. So the whole way society and the whole way intelligence works will change. And if there is a possibility for a new movement, it will be a whole new phenomenon. It will, I don't believe that the kind of a movement that was possible in the '68 can happen again today. No. I think this is over.
Спасибо большое. Вот на этот вопрос хотел...
Madam Fedina, a member of the Zinoviev club and the favorite student of Alexander Zinoviev. Let me follow up on what Madam Mironova said. You know, when you speak to the youth, you speak to your future. They have to live in a way that when they reach my age, they can talk to young people too. So they need to have children and grandchildren, and they need to have something to do in this world. And let's see, do we have situations when there is a universal recipe how to live in this world? There is one idea that we all know very well, that we live not to just eat and drink and rejoice, but we do this in order to live. So life has a lot, have a huge meaning, and so how would this meaning of life express itself in the life of the young people? So the future of young people is an essential subject, because everything will depend on how our young people will live, and we can offer advice from our past. And you, young people, you have a future that depends on the changes that are referred to as civilizational shifts. So we're dealing with new codes, new styles of life. This is like moving from the tundra to the Sahara Desert. You can understand that the living conditions in these two areas are very different. And this means that when you think about your future, you have to be guided by some kind of principles that make the society viable. So competition makes a society viable. When you have an opponent against whom you can act, or it can be a consumer, and it's your goal to fool the consumer. But what was Zinoviev's answer? You have an area of responsibility, and it is up to you to shape your future. And to a large extent, it depends on the meaning of life as you see it. And in this respect, it is very important to be mindful of Zinoviev's works, because he did not offer a recipe. We heard about 1968 and what happened back then. What is happening right now, we see it. All we can see is that we see despair in European youth. This is a deadly sin. We must inspire you in some way to enable you to see your future. I can share with you one idea from Zinoviev, and we can trace this idea on music. One of the daughters of Zinoviev, Ksenia, who is here at the conference, and she is a member of Zinoviev Club, she dedicated her life to music. What is music? Music is a language that we all speak, we all understand this language, and what we understand from music and how it developed. Unlike other types of activity, music has a criteria of determining who is a musician and who is not. This is not about saying who is good or who is bad. This is technical. So when a composer writes sheet music, he has a metronome, And if this metronome shows it, the orchestra will play it, and it will be possible. If not, the orchestra will not play it. How does the orchestra work? If they are unable to play together, there will be no music. And if different musicians play different music and there is no single whole that is formed. So this is a good metaphor, and that can be applied to life. Your life has meaning when there are other lives. And you have to listen to others, and you have to be part of a single whole with others. This is a new purpose that you are facing. We are also trying to address this challenge, but this is much more serious for you than for us. And you have this problem of finding yourself in this world, a situation when no one cares what happens to you. This is criminal logic, and even criminals understand that not everyone has to be part of this criminal world, because otherwise you will not have people against whom you can commit crimes. And going back to this music metaphor, musicians depend on music instrument manufacturers and those who write music and so on, in order to build a music hall for playing music. You have to learn acoustics and physics of acoustics. And musicians do not exist without an audience. They cannot live without an audience. So if we look at the world from this perspective, it enables us to develop our thinking in a different manner, so that we remove this despair. I think that the future is not what we can tell you, but what you will be able to do. And your actions must be effective, so that you can be also old one day and speak to the young people. One replica. We're almost out of time. I'm a philologist. I hear how you said a future word, and I see that you know Russian. Why don't you speak Russian in Moscow? Well, could you learn your presentation in Russian? Why am I telling this? I have Bulgarian students who do not know who is Ivan Vazov, who is the Tolstoy of Bulgaria. So this is just about your addiction to English language. So we mentioned the daughter of Alexander Zinoviev, about the composers. So let's pass the floor to the daughter of Alexander Zinoviev, Ksenia Zinovieva. Well, it may be a provocation what I'm going to say, but we're all adults here that we all came here today to find consensus. Well, we have to respect our elders. This is a traditional approach when this is our cultural code, the respect for the elders. But let's think whose opinion matters more: 18-year-old boy who wants to do something but has not done anything, or a philosopher of 60 years who is just tired. Whose opinion matters more? Both actually matter, I believe, because the rights of people, we are born with these rights, and they're equal for young and old, regardless of age. If you lived 40 years more, that does not mean that you deserve more respect. If you are 17 years old, we discussed youth and politics, so that's what I'm talking about. If you are 17 years old, that everyone owes you because the future is yours. Let's just think again that rights and respect are very important. What I wanted to say, this is not my main message that I wanted to make. It is important that we develop our ability to engage in dialogue, our communications etiquette, to be able to listen to others' opinions. You cannot say that one opinion is more important than the other one. So, and here I'm getting to my point. That will be a kind of a provocation. Regardless of our age, we live in a single country. This is what brings us together. We exist in a space. Of course, problems of other countries are important, but we are in a specific country, be it Russia or Germany or France, and when this dialogue fails between young and old people, we see Brexit. I will not go into details, but when young people vote against Brexit while older people vote for leaving the EU, we can see that there is a question. Let's learn on our mistakes. I cannot penetrate anyone's head, but I can say that we have this unity of a nation. For Brexit, people voted, they had their own aspirations, they thought about themselves, they had something in mind. But do you have to learn to think outside the box? We need dialogue, and for a dialogue you need more than one party. You need at least two. And this, for this, the parties to the dialogue have to have something in common. So we have to find this common core of reasonable patriotism, love for one's country, or maybe we lack ideology. So this is a statement and a question at the same time. Thank you so much. We have several speakers left, so 2 minutes each. I cannot fail to give the floor to my colleague and prominent Russian teacher and school leader of our Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. Can I take 3 minutes? Well, yes, everything for you. I'm a teacher, a merited teacher of Russia, and I came here today. I know Madam Zinoviev very well, and I could not fail to come. I have this sign, a teacher of young people, so I thought that I have to speak, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I was born in the Soviet Union, in the country of the best education at the time, and at that time education served as a social ladder for many, especially those who lived in the periphery. Zinoviev is not from Moscow. I was not from Moscow. I came from an ancient city in western Belarus, and I came to St. Petersburg, back then Leningrad. A lot of people graduated from major universities because of the social ladder that we had, because of the education that we got in school. Many went on to become teachers, educators, professors, politicians, doctors, and they were real professionals. And this was the case for Alexander Zinoviev. I will be speaking as a teacher today, and the fact that we are true professionals is the result of our education and of our family education. This is how we bring up citizens and responsible members of the community. But the schools not only deliver education, they also teach essential values. I am a chemistry and biology teacher in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, and then in Moscow, and I strongly believe that bringing up people, it is not just about learning specific subject. This is about educating people, teaching them values, and this is an essential task. And probably everyone has come across some challenges when educating your children or grandchildren. This is about physical education, moral education, aesthetic education, and most importantly, patriotic education. And I think that the school no longer performs its main function. Even the ministry is once again merely about education. It's not longer about sharing values. It is there is a lot of paid tuition education, and is no longer a social ladder for young people. The consumption society right now does not need, there is no demand for educated people. It is hard to manage these people since I have very little time left, since they ask me to finish. Well, I'm speaking Russian and they're limiting my time, so I'm also a guest here, so I want to say more. I'm speaking to young people and I want them to hear my message. I'm speaking as a teacher. Mr. Mikhail said that they've destroyed communism and now they want to destroy the Orthodox faith. I have to read to you two verses by my colleague who is merited teacher of Russia, Svetlana Medvedeva. This is a message to young people, and please hear me out. So this is a poem like a message. I'm calling on everyone to be patriotic. Russia is special. Yes, we'll soon be celebrating the day of national unity, while the Orthodox Church will celebrate the Kazan Mother of God. This poem is for young people. I believe that the future is yours. And I hope that when you hear these poems, you will understand what I say. I am proud, and you should be proud of Russia. Who will tell you, if not me, that your life is charted in your country? This is where your house, this is where your predecessors are, your friends are. I do not want to see you anywhere else. I will not be afraid to tell you this in your face. You will fulfill your destiny and the destiny of your predecessors. I believe that we will have a continuity of times and that you will be strong with the Russian language. And lastly, the door of the church is open to everyone, so everyone can pray there, and the flame will support our country for those who sang, who work, and who thought it was impossible to give up on his nation.
Проститься, не смолчать, мой Бог, судья мой высший, подвластный я суду, из краткой жизни выйду в жизнь вечную, уйду, душою в храме греюсь, живу, пока дышу. Пока дышу, надеюсь понять, как жить.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое. Спасибо.
Thank you so much. So we're joined by our guest from France. So please, briefly, because we're out of time, please welcome our guest from France. Well, I was asked to say a few words about 1968 in France. Well, I just arrived. Well, 1968, we took part in these events, and of course, our perspective and our hopes and aspirations were very much different from what we have today, although, yes, maybe the hopes remained the same, but the point of view was quite different. 1968, first of all, for us, at least for me, was a very strange time, because on the one hand, from the white immigration, and at the same time I lived among students and was part of these left movement that did not agree with the Soviet experience, but that called for social change, and we talked a lot about this with Mr. Zinoviev. I met him in the 1970s, later. And there was disagreement on this point at the time between us. And Christina probably already said this. We believe that there is no socialism in the Soviet, and he believed that this is socialism as it should be. There were two movements in France. On the one hand, there was the student movement, and everyone remembers about the students, and in terms of publicity, of course, the student movement is more visible, there is more imagination. It was something new. At the same time, we have to be mindful, this was also a workers' movement. There was a social protest that was the biggest protest after 1936, the Popular Front. And it is thanks to 1968, many social reforms, and it is thanks to the workers' movement, not the student movement. But regarding the student movement, it changed a lot in the way we think. And probably I would say now, of course I did not think about this at the time, the result was that de Gaulle left and his politics. It was the end of his rule, and probably a lot of people were unhappy, and including our friends overseas. So there was some kind of manipulation of the student movement. Probably it did exist that we did not suspect at the time, because we were just demonstrating, just all out in this struggle. It was all very important. Personally, I was part of both movements, both the student movement. We occupied the Sorbonne University, and we had a very rich intellectual life, a lot of exchanges. Then it was a complete havoc, but at the beginning it was very interesting and inspiring and insightful. There were a number of different movements and the variations of Marxism, socialism that debated, and there was these hot debates, and it was all very interesting, and it is to a large extent still relevant, the debates that were taking place at the time. On the other hand, there was this workers' movement, the labor unions and the Communist Party were doing everything to split the student movement and the workers' movement. So they were doing everything they could, and they largely succeeded in that. But sometimes they acted together, and of course the student movement inspired the young generation of workers in France, and thanks to this, the strikes, the workers' strike, had this result. And of course, quite quickly there was inflation, and there were various other economic issues, and a lot of these accomplishments were lost. But I think it gave us a lot in terms of social development, in terms of the teachings. There was even a university that was born. It was the Vincennes University near Paris. It was later transferred to Saint-Denis, and the member of our jury of the Russian awards, Christine, was there, and Irina Sokologorskaya. And this was a very interesting experiment to create this university, where there were a lot of interesting approaches and new uncharted territory to studying, for example, Russian literature that you could not find elsewhere. Unfortunately, this university was underfunded. It was not funded at all, and it was in such financial despair, so that it was kept alive only by students, by the enthusiasm. So if you have any questions.
Our section is almost over. I just will go through some of these slides. I have 37 of them. And we'll touch upon a few most important issues. It's under 2 minutes. I started my presentation with the slide from last year, 2017. Every year we present, every year we say pretty much the same things in different words, but with one message: we are for Russia, for all good. And we offer some solutions, but they are not implemented. And this is what we had last year. You see those suggestions, they are still there. This is the budget of the Russian Federation. I'm going to send all of you these slides if you want. You see that our budget is quite significant and differentiated, but there's not even this line, youth policy. It is diluted by all those other policies. And this is the budget from this year. The situation is still the same. The youth is our future, is our present, but it's not in there in the budget. Statistics, I'm not going to say too much. You have to read all these sources and compare. Starting from 2011, the statistics is terrible. When we talk about the terrible present or bright future, it's still a discussion. There are many different statistical data here. For example, statistics of 2016, 37% of Russians don't read books at all. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just the very fact that 1/3 of people don't read any books at all. 25% of Russians spend their free time in front of the TV. The data are quite sad for the current year, for next year, for the previous year, before that. We can make our decisions and resolutions, but nothing changes. For example, we have this agency responsible for Russian youth, and this is my screenshot of this agency. This is my screenshot of their page. They look at boys and girls, how many boys and girls and so on. That's all very touching, but nothing more. They are all for goodness, for patriotism. But if I ask you to raise hands, if you are part of those projects, I don't think I will find too many people. And these are the poll results. This is the information that you have free form. You can get free access to that. 75% of the youth believe it's acceptable, and you have the entire list. You may agree or disagree with that, and here's some interesting poll results. 88% could not name any person who has been repressed or purged under Stalin. If we look at our university students, we ask them, you are the cream of the nation, what do you know about 1968? Of course, some know something about that, and they deserve a place in the museum when they graduate. Who are their idols and so on? I will send it out to your to anyone who wants it. There's this email address at the end. All right, whether it's old and new in terms of our legislation, the youth and the government, you may trust or distrust these numbers, but they're there. There's this public opinion fund. It's in small font, but I just wanted to make a screenshot to prove to you that I did not invent it. And you will see how the youth treats politics, whether they are willing to get involved, where they discuss it, and whether they are willing to go and take part in rallies. 4.5 million is not just some abstract number, it's 1/3 of the population of Moscow. How realistic is that to have this 4.5 million flash mob? These are some interesting numbers that show us the real situation. You have to keep that in mind, that those numbers are there. And there's one more small point here. Here, the leaders of Russia, you know that it's this big part of our presidential administration efforts, of presidential office efforts, and this is one of the sociological centers conducting this survey whether people believe in their professional career. Anyway, and there was this online test where they want you to make a rating of Russian regions in terms of the size of their population. And sometimes our government officials have no time to make very important decisions. And even if you are a successful school graduate, what do you need to become a successful leader of Russia? There are websites that give you all sorts of tests to check whether you are a leader or not. And then our suggestions for 2018 are not much different from my suggestions a year ago, because Carcinogen has to be destroyed. If you have any questions, ask them during the break. I have 3 minutes. I cannot just keep silent. 1960s of the previous century is not just activity of youth, it's the restoration of Russian philosophical thought. It started with the works by Zinoviev. We went beyond the class approach and class struggle and understood the global processes that we are in. That's my first comment, very important one. My second comment, it's about youth and politics. What is youth? What is politics? What do they understand about politics? Youth survives by hopes. At our age, we live by fears. And the future is closer to the young people than to those who are older. But the youth is aggressive and healthy, something we don't have. And that's what you need to have any relations with the future. So the youth is in the post-conflict situation when it realized, we are now realizing that you live in the times of unsurmountable conflicts, unresolvable conflicts. And before the works by Zinoviev, we thought that something could be resolved. And how did we get in this situation? Why is that? Because there's this fight for values with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and when ideology disappeared, we understood it was not about ideology, this conflict between Russian and Western society. There's no ideology, but our value basis is different. And that's why we will be fighting for a position. Position is what you defend. This is what you would be willing to die for. It's not some kind of future, but here and now, risking something, expressing your view, criticizing the society, or criticizing yourself, you're taking a step forward. It's either into the future or backward, into the past. The world is changing fast, and here and now, we decide what the future is going to be. Do the youth know what we mean by this self-determination? And there's also this concept of self-limitation. There's also this ability to control yourself. It has to organize itself. It has to keep asking this question, why am I here? What am I here for? The entire Russian philosophical thought was about searching or looking for good and evil. And that's how we are different from the consumer society. And here we realize that we are actors of history, and we only realize that after the works of Zinoviev, who came back to the Soviet Union after the disintegration, when Russia was at the threshold of disintegration again, and he came back to Russia, he understood, he realized that he was needed here in Russia more than in the West. We had to protect our sovereignty. Future is fighting for what you believe in. If you need to become politicians if you want your own future. What kind of values are we going to take to the future with us when you come to replace us? What will you give to your children? It depends on your worldview. For some, the worldview is to get your salary and your car, your dacha, and another worldview is this contradiction between the Western worldview and what we have here in Russia. Thank you for being with us. Let's still take a brief coffee break. Thank you.